The wind came in hot from the south, dry as old bones, carried with it the smell of dung, gun oil, and sunburnt flesh. Horses swayed in their hitchings, tails flicking nervously. The town of Whetstone sat half asleep in the midday glare, its buildings low and bleached, their shadows sharp against the dirt. Nothing here was soft, not the language, not the whiskey, not the people. A place made to forget things, a place the woman rode into without a word. She came alone, dressed in black that had long since faded to gray. Dust clung to the hem of her coat. Her boots made no sound as she dismounted. Even the horse, a mottled gray with eyes like old silver coins, stepped with ghostly quiet. The townsfolk watched her from under brims and behind shutters. They didn't speak her name. Names had a way of stirring things up, and she looked like someone who carried her dead close. The widow walked past the saloon, ignoring the lean men on the porch playing cards in silence, past the sheriff's office, where a star-shaped sign swung on one nail, too lazy to warn anyone. Her eyes didn't scan for trouble. Trouble had a way of finding its own path to her. She headed straight for the makeshift tent pitched at the edge of the market, canvas bleached by sun, its sides painted with fading words. Sins redeemed, lost ones reclaimed. Inside, flies buzzed thick over the sweet, raw molasses and old sweat. A man stood behind a crate, dressed in the tattered remnants of a preacher's coat. His eyes were too small for his face, and his smile too wide for his mouth. Behind him sat 3 children on the ground, knees pulled to their chests, sacks pulled down over their heads. One of them rocked gently, humming something tuneless. The preacher raised his voice like a showman. "Foundlings from the wastelands," he said. "Orphaned by sin, but pure in spirit. No names, no past. For those with coin and kindness alike." No one clapped. A woman near the back crossed herself and walked away. A drunk tried to spit and missed his boot. The preacher coughed, hand dramatically to his chest, as if summoning sympathy. The widow watched in silence. "I ain't here to be entertained," she said, voice low and hoarse. The preacher turned, startled. He hadn't seen her come in. No one ever did. "I'm here to buy," she added and pointed. The preacher blinked. All 3. She nodded. The silver she dropped onto the crate didn't clink. It thudded, dull and heavy. Enough for a good horse and a month's supplies. Maybe more. The preacher's hands twitched, then snatched the coins. "No refunds," he muttered. She crouched beside the children. They didn't flinch, but they didn't move either, not until her fingers brushed the cloth of the 3rd child's sleeve. A voice, dry and small, came from under the sack. Not frightened, not curious. "Mary," it said. The widow froze. Her hand stiffened, then slowly retreated. The preacher hadn't heard, but she had. That name hadn't been spoken to her in years. Not here, not by anyone who lived. She didn't ask how the child knew, didn't demand an explanation. Instead, she stood up and jerked her head toward the tent flap. "They ride with me." The preacher nodded too quickly. "Of course. Blessings upon." She was already walking out. The townsfolk parted like smoke as she led the children to her horse. One at a time, she lifted them up into the saddlebags rigged for riding. Soft bedrolls tied for comfort, enough room for legs to hang free. The smallest one clutched the saddle horn tight. The other 2 remained silent, sacks still in place. A voice in the saloon called out, slurred and cruel, "Buy in, and for work or for ghosts?" The widow turned her head just enough. The wind caught her coat, revealing a 6-shot Colt, worn down to gray steel. Her eyes didn't blink. The man spat and looked away. By the time the horse turned eastward toward the edge of town, the streets had emptied again. She didn't look back. The children didn't speak. They rode out through prairie scrub, past dried creek beds and the carcasses of old cattle. Vultures circled like slow-moving sins overhead. The land offered no welcome. It only took and watched. The sun dipped lower, bleeding itself out over the horizon. Still they rode. No campfire was lit. No names were exchanged. But in the silence between hoofbeats and wind, the widow heard it again, faint, like a prayer left out in the rain. "Mary." This time it came from behind her, barely above breath. The same voice, the same child. Her name, spoken not like a threat or a greeting, but as a key in a lock. She didn't turn around. She didn't speak. But something in her chest, something long thought buried, twitched like a match struck in the dark. By morning, they would reach the old ranch. By morning, she would decide if she'd made a mistake. But for now, they rode as one, for silhouettes stretched long across the dying light, and behind them, the wind carried whispers. The prairie stretched so wide and silent it felt like riding through the ribs of some ancient, godless beast. Grass whispered beneath the hooves of the mare, brittle and yellow, the color of old teeth. The land had no shade, no forgiveness, and no place to hide. Still, the widow rode, 3 children clinging to her saddle like stitched-on shadows. None had spoken since the one whispered her name. The others kept their heads low beneath the sacks, their breathing light and shallow. The widow said nothing. She did not ask which child had spoken or how they knew her name. Questions like that had teeth, and she had already bled too much for answers. By dusk, they reached a dried riverbed lined with mesquite. The widow dismounted, knees cracking, and tied the mare to a low-hanging limb. She moved with a slow, practiced efficiency, untying the children, guiding them down, not with kindness, but with the stern patience of someone who had known too many good things that turned bad. She unrolled blankets, poured water from a goatskin into a tin cup, handed it to the smallest child. Still no words. She built no fire. Smoke could bring men with worse hungers than wolves. Instead, they sat in darkness lit only by a bleeding sky. The wind picked up, dry and sharp, lashing grit against her cheeks. The smallest child, the one with trembling hands, hummed under the sack. A simple tune, broken and uneven, but the widow knew it. A cradle song. Her mother had sung it to her. She had sung it to no one, not since the grave swallowed what it shouldn't have. Her spine stiffened. "Stop that," she said. The humming ceased. She looked to the horizon, watching for motion. Ghosts didn't walk in daylight, but men did, and men could be worse. Her fingers traced the worn handle of her coat. Habit, fear, memory, she had taken them. Paid coin like blood for flesh. And now here they sat, heads covered like corpses in a morgue, silent and waiting. But waiting for what? She pulled a strip of jerky from her pack, handed it to the tallest child. He reached out blindly, fingers long and scarred, and took it without sound. The second child refused food, knees pulled tight to their chest, head bent low. "You don't eat, you don't ride," she said flatly. "And I don't carry bones." A pause. Then the second child took the jerky. The widow leaned against a flat stone, her back aching. She looked at them and tried to find reason. They were too quiet, too still. Children were supposed to fidget, to squabble, to ask for things. But these 3 sat like they'd already been carved into mourning. She dozed in fits. The dreams were sharp-edged. Her husband's face, twisted in pain. A door slammed. Screams muffled by fire. Then, always, hooves pounding away and the sound of her own voice calling names that never came back. She woke before dawn. The sky wore a pale bruise. Coyotes yipped from far off. She stood slowly, stretching muscles that had forgotten warmth. The children hadn't moved. She stepped closer, squatting beside the smallest one. Dirt streaked the knees of their pants. And beneath the sack, a small hand clutched something tight. She gently peeled the fingers open. A metal locket. Her locket, oval, dull silver. She pried it open. Inside, her face. Younger, unsmiling. And beside it, the man she married. He wore the uniform of Confederacy, long dissolved into ash. She'd buried that locket with him. The widow stood, heart hammering against the walls of her ribs. She turned toward the children, but her voice caught in her throat. The ground beneath her felt suddenly thin, like ice just before it cracks. She forced calm into her limbs. "Where did you get this?" No answer, but the tallest child tilted their head just slightly, as though listening to something she couldn't hear. Her breath fog in the chill. She looked at the land around them, then up to the rising sun. There were places out here where time ran sideways. where old wrongs lingered like rot in the bones of the earth. Places men didn't speak of unless whiskey loosened their tongues. She had come from one of those places. The ride resumed in silence. The children rode two to the saddle, the smallest cradled in front. The mare bore them without protest, hooves steady against the uncertain trail. Around midday, a vulture flew low overhead, its wings carving the sky like a knife. The widow watched its shadow cross the children. None flinched. She felt the omen settle in her gut. They crested a rise by late afternoon, and there was below a cluster of collapsed fences, a half-burnt barn, and a single house, weather-beaten and gray. The porch sagged. The well was dry, but it was still standing. Her home, or what was left of it. She helped the children down. The moment their feet touched the ground, the smallest one removed the sack. The widow turned sharply, but did not stop them. The face beneath was young, but hollowed by something that didn't belong in childhood. Eyes dark as riverbed mud. A thin scar ran from temple to jaw, and beneath that, something sharper, recognition. The child looked up at her and said, without inflection, "You used to plant marigolds." The widow's throat closed. She had planted marigolds once, before the fire, before the soldiers, before she buried the name she'd been born with and took up silence like a shield. She nodded slowly. Her voice was a rasp when it finally came. "Yes." The other two children didn't remove their sacks. Not yet, but they stood straighter now, as if awaiting permission. The wind shifted. Something in the air had changed, less empty, more watchful. The widow felt it in her bones. Not danger. Not quite. Something returning. Behind them, far off across the plain, a dust trail rose. Small, deliberate, not the wind's doing. The past, she thought, always finds a door it left open. She ushered the children inside. No need for fire. Just walls. Just time. Her grip on the locket stayed tight. Knuckles pale. Tomorrow, she would ask their names. Tomorrow, she would decide what she was willing to believe. But tonight, she would keep watch. Because something had spoken her name. And not everything that spoke did so from the world of the living. The wind howled louder in the days that followed, as if the land itself had begun to speak again after years of holding its breath. The widow moved through her hollowed home like a ghost stitching herself back into the seams of forgotten life. Dust lay thick on every surface. The walls whispered with heat. Yet the children didn't seem to mind. They fit into the silence too easily, as if they'd always lived with the weight of things unsaid. The smallest, now without the sack, followed her like a shadow, never asking questions, never straying too far. The other two still wore theirs, even indoors. She did not press them, let them choose the time, if they had one. She fed them beans, cornbread, broth made from dry meat, and whatever roots she could still pull from the brittle ground. They never complained. When she handed the plate, they took it. When it was time to sleep, they lay down on the floorboard without fuss. The nights were too quiet. Once, she heard one of them cry. Just once. A sound too dry for real tears. It didn't come again. In the second week, she found a boy, the tallest, tracing a pattern into the dirt outside the barn. A circle with jagged edges. She knew that symbol. It was carved into the necks of men who raided borderland towns during the war. A brand, the mark of a mercenary gang called the Spade Sons. Her husband had once killed a man for wearing it. She'd buried the blade with him. She didn't speak of it to the boy, just covered it with her boot and told him to finish watering the cracked garden rose. He obeyed without looking up. Inside, she unfolded a map from the bottom drawer of an old bread box. Her husband's map, ink faded by time. She followed the trails with a finger, past old names and bloody crossings. There, beneath a hand-drawn X near Crow's End, a note in her husband's handwriting. Preacher paid in silver. Keep it buried. Burn the rest. She didn't remember seeing it before, but it was his writing. She knew that curve of guilt in his S's. Her hands trembled as she folded the map again. That night, the second child, still sack-covered, spoke for the first time. "Why didn't you come for us?" The voice was raspy. young, but angry in the way only a wounded heart can be. The widow looked across the room. They sat near the cold hearth, knees hugged close, the sack damp with breath. She swallowed. I didn't know you were alive. You knew what they did. I knew pieces, she admitted. I didn't know they took children. The sack turned slightly, listening. The wind outside screamed through the cracks in the window panes. One shutter banged against the side of the house. The child didn't flinch. Did he? The voice asked. It was a question about her husband, but she didn't ask which they meant. The answer was the same. Not enough. The next morning, all 3 sacks were gone. She found them lying along the fence, watching the horizon, 3 small figures made smaller by the vastness of the land. She didn't recognize them fully. Each bore pieces of her past. A scar she remembered stitching shut, a curl of hair like her sister's boy, eyes like her father's horse when it had to be put down. But none of them were hers. Not truly. And still, they had been hurt because of her. That afternoon, the mare whinnied sharply and stamped the earth. The widow stepped onto the porch, eyes scanning the distance. Dust rose in a thin line to the south. Riders. She whistled the children inside, bolted the door, and set her rifle against the windowsill. The youngest clutched the locket to their chest. She knew who it was before they ever got close. The preacher wasn't dead. He rode at the center of a crooked line of men, each one wearing dust-stiffened coats and gun belts that clinked with cruel memory. They stopped just beyond rifle range. The preacher raised one hand and removed his hat. His smile was the same. You got something belongs to me, he called out. She didn't answer. The children stayed low, crouched beneath the window. I ain't come to barter, he said, voice carrying on the wind. They're not yours, Mary. You paid coin, not blood. At the sound of her name, the youngest child flinched. The preacher raised a silver coin in his fingers. This bought silence, not forgiveness. You were supposed to bury them, not raise them. She stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, but not raised. You lost your teeth when the war ended. Crawled back into the dust. He laughed. One of his men spat. You think they love you? He asked, eyes gleaming. They don't even know what you were. The youngest stepped out beside her, barefoot, small hands clenched. I know enough, the child said. The preacher's eyes narrowed. The coin vanished into his pocket. You will regret this, he said, quiet now. By dawn, this house will be ash. The widow didn't move. The preacher turned his horse. The others following like shadows stitched him. They disappeared into the belly of the horizon. Inside, she set the rifle down. Her heart pounded like thunder behind her ribs. The children stood in a tight line by the hearth, waiting. They'll come tonight, she said. We know, the boy replied. She stepped forward, knees aching, voice low. There's a cellar beneath the floorboards. It's not much, but it's stone. If they burn us out, we'll still be breathing. The girl who had spoken the night before touched the scar on her jaw. We don't want to hide. The widow stared at them, these strange, broken things. Not hers, not born of her body or shaped by her hands. But somewhere along the bloodied trail, they had become hers in ways that defied name or law. She knelt, finally, bones grinding. Then we'll stand, she said. The children nodded. Outside, the wind died down. The land went quiet, and the sky turned the color of dried blood. The sky broke open just after midnight, a black mouth spilling stars and thunder. The storm came dry first, wind scouring the plains, kicking up dust and ghosts. Then came the wet, slow, steady rain that tapped like fingers on a coffin lid. Inside the house, the widow stood at the center of the room, rifle loaded, oil lamp flickering behind her. The children sat in a half circle, eyes wide, shoulders stiff, faces drawn not with fear, but readiness. No one had slept. From the edge of the porch, the land stretched blank and silent, until a flash of lightning carved the night open. 5 riders, maybe 6, moved across the ridge, their shapes momentarily etched in light. Then darkness returned, deeper than before. The preacher wasn't in a rush. He was a man who liked his fear slow-cooked. His men dismounted at the fence line, spreading out. She could hear the jingle of stirrups, the soft clicks of rifle bolts being drawn back. Rain beaded on the window glass, hiding them for now. "Stay low," she told the children. "If I fall, don't run." "Not yet." The youngest child stood. In one hand they held the locket, in the other the rusted knife the widow had found buried beneath a loose porch board the day before. The blade had belonged to her husband once. They didn't speak, just nodded. The first shot cracked the air, missing the window by inches. Wood splintered. The widow didn't flinch. She aimed into the dark and fired once. A scream followed, then a curse. She ducked to reload. Heart steady as a drum. Outside, boots hit dirt. Men running. She caught glimpses, coats flapping like torn flags, faces hidden by scarves, eyes too wild for courage. The children moved with eerie calm. The tall boy had taken the second rifle, crouched at the rear window. The girl lit one of the oil lanterns and slid it across the floor, where it spilled light toward the door, drawing attention. Then she ran to the back wall, where she quietly pried up a floorboard the night before. The trapdoor to the cellar waited there, open like a mouth. A shot rang out too close. The widow leaned around the doorframe and fired again. Another scream. Rain poured in sideways now, cold and sharp, soaking the hem of her coat. Someone reached the porch. She heard the creak of a boot on the warped wood. Then a voice. Calm, tired. "You're outnumbered, Mary." It was him. The preacher stepped into view, drenched but smiling. His coat hung loose, as though he carried no weight. "You know how this ends," he said. "You gave up on justice years ago." She lowered the rifle an inch. "And you never started." He stepped forward. She didn't fire. "You let your husband die for a lie," he said. "He took our silver and thought he could bury what we did. You thought hiding made you clean, but you're still dirty. And these kids, you think they're yours now." A faint sound came behind him, a creak of another step. The widow's eyes didn't shift. She spoke to the darkness. "They're not mine by blood," she said. "They're mine by choice." A flash of movement. The youngest child stepped from the side, barefoot, silent. The preacher turned too late. The rusted knife drove into his thigh. He roared, twisted, tried to strike, but the child had already darted back. That single second was enough. The widow raised her rifle. The preacher's last expression wasn't fear or anger. It was awe, as though, in the final second, he recognized that he had never understood the strength of a person who had already lost everything. The shot took him clean. He dropped without drama. The rest of his men scattered. One shouted something about a devil woman. Another limped into the darkness. None looked back. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The house was riddled with bullet holes. The porch bled wood and water. The children helped her drag the preacher's body to the willow tree out back. She did not bury him. She left him for the land. They stood together under the silver morning, soaked and exhausted. "He won't be the last," the girl said, her voice now shaped like steel. "No," the widow replied, "but I will." That day, she fixed the door. The boy patched the roof with salvage tin. The smallest one found seeds in the shed, marigolds. They planted them under the windows. When the wind blew that evening, it was quieter, less angry, like the land was watching, still, but not judging. They sat on the porch together, for against the world. The rifle leaned nearby, untouched for once. The children didn't speak. They didn't need to. The widow looked at them and understood what the preacher had failed to. That family was never about names or blood. It was built in the spaces between moments, in sacrifices made without promise of return, in the willingness to stand and bleed when running would be easier. The past had knocked, and she had answered with fire, with blood, and with love.